Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 15 of the JFK assassination 60 years later. When we left off in the last episode, we learned that the official narrative surrounding the Zapruder film is that it was put on a plane in Dallas on the afternoon of Saturday, November 23rd, one day after the assassination, and taken to Chicago, where Life magazine's printing plant was located. The official narrative is that the film was then taken to the printing plant, they made copies of the frames, and that those frames were then put into a black and white format in Life magazine's November 29th issue. That's been the official narrative ever since. The only problem with that narrative is that it's false. And we're going to examine the false nature of this narrative in this episode. But let's put things into context first. Remember all of the evidence that establishes the fraudulent nature of the autopsy, particularly the fraudulent photograph that shows the back of Kennedy's head to be intact. Recall the overwhelming evidence, convincing evidence, I think, beyond a reasonable doubt, that establishes the fraudulent nature of that photograph. You got Sandra Spencer, the chief petty officer for the Navy, who worked closely with the White House, and she established that the autopsy photograph she developed on the weekend of the assassination in a top secret manner. She was told it was classified. She wasn't going to talk about it, but she told the Assassination Records Review Board, who released her from her vow of secrecy, that the photograph she developed had a massive exit-sized hole in the back of Kennedy's head. And this matched up with what Dr. McClellan had said all of his life, including right after the assassination, along with the whole long line of witnesses that we outlined: Clint Hill, Nurse Bowen, Nurse Bell, all the people that said, yes, there was a massive exercise hole there in the back of Kennedy's head. For decades, assassination researchers were convinced that not only was the autopsy photograph fraudulent, but the Zapruder film had to be fraudulent too. Because the Zapruder film, as we pointed out in the previous episode, matched the autopsy photograph. In other words, it shows the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact after the headshot wound. But the problem that the research community had was that they couldn't prove it. And so whenever somebody would bring this point up, the people of the official narrative of the assassination would say, oh, yeah, right. The autopsy photograph is fraudulent. Sure. If the photograph's fraudulent, then the film's fraudulent. How ridiculous is that? You've got a conspiracy theory. So they would revert back to their conspiracy theory thing of, now we've got a conspiracy theory on top of a conspiracy theory on top of a conspiracy theory. We've got a triple conspiracy theory. And they would joke about it, and they would chide people that were saying, it's got to be fraudulent. Because you see, there's no way around it. That once you conclude that Sandra Spencer is telling the truth, and that Dr. McClellan has always been telling the truth, and all these other witnesses have been telling the truth, there's no other way around it. That the autopsy photograph has to be fraudulent because it shows the back of Kennedy's head to be intact. But then there's no way around it with respect to the Zapruder film too. It has to be fraudulent too. And we all know what that's going to do. It's going to generate, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. But like I say, there's just no way around it. But the problem is that nobody could prove this. You could prove Sandra Spencer's testimony. You could prove that, showing that evidence like I have in this series of regarding this assassination. I've provided overwhelming evidence showing that autopsy photograph is fraudulent. But people that were adhering to this view could not prove in any way that the Zapruder film was fraudulent. It was more a logical type argument that it has to be fraudulent. Well, like I say, people will respond, conspiracy theory, because the only people who could alter a film like this were in Hollywood. Now, Hollywood could do it. I mean, they had the equipment, they had the expertise. They could delete frames by making a copy of the film and then deleting frames and then reproducing that copy as an original, or painting over the back of Kennedy's head. So they had the expertise to do this. But there was never any evidence that anybody from Hollywood was flown into Chicago that weekend. And certainly nobody ever surfaced out of Hollywood saying, I was part of that operation. And there was never any evidence that the Zapruder film was shipped to Hollywood on the weekend of the assassination. And so people were stymied who were making this claim for decades. And then suddenly, out of the clear blue, unexpectedly, a man named Dino Brugioni bursts asunder this official narrative. Now, who is Dino Brugioni? Well, he's deceased now, but he happened to be, at this time in the 1960s, the world's most renowned photographic analyst. I mean, in the world of photographic analysis, Dino Brugioni would be a superstar. I mean, nobody could surpass him. Or if you did find somebody, I mean, it would be a very rare thing. This guy was a CIA official. And he was, I mean, clearly one of these good people working for an evil organization. And he comes across as a super good guy and a super genuine guy, super honest guy. And you're going to be able to judge his statements too, because remember, early on, I said that in a criminal case, or I think I said this. If I didn't, I'm going to point it out again. In a criminal case, or in a civil case too, the courts don't allow hearsay evidence. Now, hearsay evidence is like if I say, well, Joe Blow said this is what happened. Well, the judge is not going to let me do that, because the judge wants, and the law wants, the jury to see what Joe Blow says. So they got to bring Joe Blow to the stand to say, this is what I saw. And so the jury can judge his credibility. They can look at him and so forth. And you have that opportunity with Dr. McClellan, because there's countless interviews there online with Dr. Robert McClellan. You can just Google them, and I think you'll see that McClellan comes across as a very genuine, honest person. I put him right there in the same category as Sandra Spencer. Unfortunately, they did not videotape Sandra Spencer's testimony before the ARRB, but as Jeremy Gunn, the general counsel for the ARRB, later said, that there was, in his opinion, no more credible witness during the entire term of the ARRB than Sandra Spencer. Well, you can do the same thing with Dino Brugioni. You can judge his credibility because there's a videotaped interview with Douglas Horn, who I've previously mentioned, where Brugioni relates what happened here. And you can begin by Googling Brugioni, or go to Wikipedia and read about Brugioni. I mean, this guy is like renowned, the best in the world. He participated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was one of the analysts of the photographs that were taken of the Soviet missile sites there in Cuba. He later wrote a book about that episode. He wrote other books on photographic analysis. According to Wikipedia, this guy was at the top of the line in terms of photographic analysis. Well, there was an act of sheer serendipity that took place here. I mean, it's just so strange how life works out sometimes. I mean, if this serendipitous act had not happened, we would have never learned what happened to this Zapruder film. We never know about the falsity of the official narrative. What happened is this. You'll recall that I mentioned a book in episode 13 when I was talking about books that I recommended. And I mentioned a book called Mary's Mosaic by Peter Janney. Mary Meyer was a woman who lived in the Georgetown section of Hollywood. She was sort of an artiste type, sort of the predecessor to the hippies, kind of the beat generation. She was painting, became a successful artist there in Georgetown. Very educated woman, very cultured. She had been married to a high official in the CIA named Cord Meyer. They had begun their lives after World War II as part of the international peace movement to bring peace to the world, to end the forever wars that had always been going on. But her husband goes off to the dark side. He goes off to the CIA. He thinks this is the way to establish peace. She sees right through this. She sees this is a dark side, that this will be generating the forever wars. And she was right, but he couldn't see it. And that was, I think, the principal reason they ended up getting divorced. They had also lost a child, which undoubtedly put a lot of strain on the marriage. Kid had gotten run over in an automobile accident, a horrible tragedy. But he ends up going off and establishing his career at the CIA. She establishes herself in Georgetown, sort of in the beat community, predecessors to the hippies. She's smoking dope and that sort of thing. And most important, she's having an affair with President John F. Kennedy at the time of his assassination. And I think played a significant role in the breakthrough that he achieved after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll talk about in a later episode. In any event, she's murdered on the C&O Canal Trail as she was walking along the trail there in D.C., and a black man is charged with a crime. He happened to be in the vicinity, and he's represented by a renowned black attorney named Roundtree. I forget her first name, but renowned woman, very principled, fantastic lawyer. And she represents him for free because she's convinced he's innocent. And, of course, at this point, nobody knows that Mary Pinchot Meyer had been having an affair with President Kennedy. And it's not really known at the time that she challenged the whole official version of the assassination, the Warren report. She didn't buy into this. She was convinced that it was a national security state regime change operation. So she's murdered there on the C&O Canal Trail, and the murder has all the earmarks of a professional hit job. And you'll see this if you purchase Mary's Mosaic, which I highly recommend. It's a fantastic book. Well, in the process of investigating this assassination of Mary Pinchot Meyer, Janney is doing a lot of investigative work. Recall that Janney's father had worked in the CIA, a top official. I mean, he was right there with Cord Meyer and James Jesus Angleton and the rest of the CIA crew during that period of time. And so Janney comes to suspect that this was a state-sponsored operation, the assassination, and that this guy, I think his name was Raymond Crumb, was just or Raymond Crump, not really sure, but that he was just a patsy, just sort of like Oswald was over here in the Kennedy assassination. That he was being framed to take the hit, and the case goes to trial, and the jury finds that this guy is innocent, not guilty, and Janney determines that this was a state-sponsored assassination. So he's investigating this thing when he discovers the existence of Dino Brugioni. And so he contacts Brugioni. And here's the act of serendipity that Brugioni says, Brugioni is obviously this very genial guy, very friendly. And he says to Peter Janney, "Oh, yeah, I knew your dad. Great guy. Why don't you come by and we'll visit?" So Janney says, "Great." So Janney goes and starts visiting with Brugioni there in Brugioni's house, and they start discussing the assassination and so forth. And Brugioni just happens to mention that he had possession of the Zapruder film. Oh, this was shocking. Now, for Brugioni, it was like no big deal. Now, he had been told that it was classified, his possession of the Zapruder film, but this was like 50 years before, and everybody knew about the Zapruder film, and the assassination was 50 years ago. And so for him, even though he had been told it was classified, it was like, oh, no big deal. He's mentioning the Zapruder film. It's like, no big deal. I think he technically violated his classified oath type thing. But nonetheless, he says, oh, yeah, I had the Zapruder film on Saturday night of the assassination, the night after the assassination. And of course, Janney is like, oh my gosh. And so they talk about it. And then Janney goes back to Doug Horn, who he had become friends with while investigating this the murder of Mary Meyer. And Janney at this point was also convinced that the Kennedy assassination was a regime change operation, which is what Horn believed. So they start talking about this. This is in the late 2010s. Okay, so don't tell me the CIA can't keep secrets. They kept this part of the operation secret for some 50 years here, and Horn is like stunned. This is a huge breakthrough that's taking place, and so they end up videotaping an interview with Brugioni, and you can see that videotaped interview online. And so in this interview, Horn is asking Brugioni all kinds of questions, and I'll relate to you in a second what he said, but the important thing is that you can judge his credibility. You can go online and find this videotape interview with Douglas Horn and Brugioni. You can just Google those names and put video or whatever, and you'll find it. And I will guarantee you that you will put Brugioni, after watching him, in the same category as Saundra Spencer and Dr. Robert McClellan. Same level. Remember, Jeremy Gunn, the general counsel, said that there was never a more credible witness before the ARRB than Saundra Spencer. Well, I put Dr. Robert McClellan in the same category. And when you see McClellan's interviews online, you'll see what I'm talking about. And Brugioni's the same way. And this is what I was talking about, that in a trial, they're not going to allow hearsay. They're going to put the witness there because they want you, as a jury, to see the witness, to judge his credibility by watching him. I will guarantee you, you watch Brugioni, you will have no doubts about his credibility. He is a classic example of a good person, an honest person, a person with integrity, who is working for an evil organization. Okay, he doesn't recognize it as an evil organization any more than Cord Meyer recognized it as an evil organization. At least not when he went to work there. He may have come to that realization later on and when he was dying. But the reason I say that is because on his deathbed, they asked him, who do you think killed your former wife? And he says something like, the same people who killed Kennedy. And so, in any event, Brugioni tells Horn and Janney that on Saturday evening of the assassination, he is summoned to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C. This was the CIA's photographic plant there in Washington, D.C. And this is where Brugioni worked, at NITPIC, National Photographic Interpretation Center. He was second in command there. The man in command was a man named Arthur Lundahl. And Lundahl contacts Brugioni and says, you need to report to NITPIC this evening, where you're going to meet people that are going to be bringing you this film. And what you need to do is do blow-ups of individual frames of the film, which they will select, and then put them on briefing boards, like poster boards. And this was nothing new to Brugioni. I mean, Brugioni was known as the briefing board czar at NITPIC because he was so good at doing this type of work. And he had his own special way of doing things. For example, the way he did these briefing boards is he had two separate boards, like poster boards, but they were on boards, fortified. And then he put the photographs on each board too, and then he had a hinge in the middle so that he could close the two briefing boards together and then carry them that way. And then somebody that wanted to see them would just open them up with the hinge, and then on one side are photographs, the other side are photographs that are blow-ups from the film. So that was his method of doing briefing boards. And Lundahl says, report there on Saturday night to do this with this particular film. Now, it wasn't known as the Zapruder film then, but it was the Zapruder film. And so there's another thing you should know about this particular weekend, that not only was Dino Brugioni the second in command at NITPIC, and therefore really knew everything that was going on there. He also, that particular weekend, was what was called the duty officer in charge of the building. And so, as the duty officer in charge, he would necessarily know about any operations that were taking place at Nitpick during that particular weekend. That was part of the job of the duty officer in charge. So, Brugioni proceeds to tell Janney, they brought us a Zapruder film. And he later relates this in the videotaped interview with Doug Horn. That what happened was two men who were representing themselves to be Secret Service agents show up on Saturday evening, and they say, we have this film that was the Zapruder film. We need you to do blow-ups of the film, selected frames, and then put them on briefing boards so that whoever is going to be seeing the briefing boards can examine these photographs. Well, one of the interesting twists of this was that, remember that the film was an 8mm format because it had been slit down the middle there in Dallas, recall that. And so when it comes to Nitpick there with Brugioni, it turns out that the CIA does not have an 8mm movie projector. Zapruder had an 8mm movie projector in his home, and lots of families all across America had 8mm movie projectors, but the CIA didn't because they were accustomed to viewing films in 16mm format. And you can't watch an 8mm film in a 16mm film projector. So, and this is late Saturday night. So in order to view this film, they had to find the owner of a photography store there in Washington, where he had to come down and open up his store on late Saturday night in order to either sell or give a 8mm movie projector to the CIA. So they bring back the 8mm film projector and they start watching the Zapruder film, and they watch it repeatedly. And the two men who are representing themselves to be Secret Service agents are selecting out which frames they want blown up. And they're telling Brugioni, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and so forth. And so then Brugioni makes copies of those frames, he blows them up, and then prepares briefing boards into the late night, that Saturday night, into the wee hours of Sunday morning. It goes past midnight. In the meantime, after the blow-ups are made, the two men who are representing themselves to be Secret Service agents leave with the film. Okay? And so they go somewhere. Okay? Now, where do they go? Well, it turns out, let me back up here for a second here, that when Brugioni's describing what they're doing with this film to Janney and Horn, he says there is no question but that this was the original Zapruder film. He says, for one thing, those two men that were saying they were Secret Service were really nervous. But Brugioni, because they were afraid that the film might get damaged, but Brugioni says there was no question that this was the original film because it was so crystal clear. Now remember, this is the world's most foremost analyst on photography. Also, let's go back to Dallas for a second. When the film was slit down the middle at Kodak after it had been taken to the Jameson Company for making copies, and they now had 3 copies in the original there at Kodak, and they had developed all the copies in the original, and they had slit down the middle. They were watching both the original and a copy. And the Kodak officials there later said that you could clearly see the difference between the copies and the original. Now, these were first-generation copies that Jameson had done. That is, they had been made off the original. Nonetheless, the Kodak people there said you could still tell the difference. That the copies were a bit fuzzy compared to the crystal clear crisp nature of the original. And that's what Brugioni said to Janney and Horn. He says, this thing was crystal clear. He said, there's no question this was the original. Well, then what happens to the film after it leaves there on Saturday night? Well, there's another thing you should know about this. This was a highly classified operation that Brugioni was told, this is classified. Everybody knows what classified is. You don't ever talk about it with anyone. Okay? Brugioni understood that. Now, on Sunday night, there's another team that is summoned to nitpick. And that team is headed by a man named Homer McMahon. Now, how do we know this? Well, Homer McMahon testified before the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. And he tells the ARRB that on Sunday night, he was summoned to nitpick by Arthur Lundahl, the head of the nitpick operations, to do what Brugioni did. To take this film that was being delivered to him by a man purporting to be a Secret Service agent, do blow-ups of selected frames, and put them on briefing boards. Okay, so McMahon's team, which also is very classified, McMahon cannot talk about this. Their job is to do exactly what Brugioni's team was assigned to do. Now, does this make any sense? I mean, why would you have two separate teams doing the exact same thing? It doesn't make any sense. Now, you might say, well, Jacob, maybe they forgot to do some selected frames, or they had second thoughts and felt like they needed to do more blow-ups. Okay, well then, why not call Brugioni back to do the additional blow-ups, additional briefing boards on Sunday night? Instead, they bring back they bring a team that is entirely different and is classified. So you've got two compartmentalized operations taking place. You've got the Saturday night operation and you've got the Sunday night operation. And I guarantee you that Homer McMahon, okay, his testimony is not on videotape. The ARRB has it all written out. I think if you read McMahon's testimony, he comes across just as genuine and just as honest as Dino Brugioni. He's another example of what appears to be a very honest man working for a very evil organization. But he's just involved with photography, just like Dino Brugioni. That's their job at the CIA. And McMahon's just relating this under oath as to what happened there on Sunday night. But the Sunday night team is not permitted to know about the Saturday night operation, okay? Because it's compartmentalized. It's totally separate. Now, why would that be? Okay, that's the first question. Is why does that have to be compartmentalized? Brugioni's team is not permitted to know about the Sunday night operation. And this goes on for 50 years, where the Saturday and the Sunday night teams don't know of each other's existence. In fact, when Brugioni was told about the Sunday night operation by Horn and Janney, he said, that's not possible. He says, I'm the second in command. He says, I would have known about that. And he says, not only that, I was the duty officer. The duty officer is supposed to know everything. But you see, Lundahl, the guy who was coordinating both operations, didn't let Brugioni know about this. Now, why? Okay, you already suspect that something's awry here with these two operations. It's something not good is going on. Well, the Secret Service agent, or the man who says he's a Secret Service agent on Saturday night, he introduces himself as Bill Smith. Okay, Secret Service agent Bill Smith. And he says to Homer McMahon, here's the film, make the blow-ups and do the briefing boards. Now, the Homer McMahon team does briefing boards in a totally different manner from the way Dino Brugioni made briefing boards. With the Sunday night team, they just put them on boards with no hinges in the middle, just separate boards, and they post the photographs. But the same type of operation, they selected out particular frames and blow them up, put them on briefing boards. And that film, the Sunday night film, is the film that we've all seen now, or most of us have seen online or in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. That is the supposed original film that everybody's accustomed to seeing. Now, there's something that you should know about that Sunday night film. That the Secret Service agent Bill Smith brings it in a 16 millimeter format. Now, recall, if we go back to Dallas, that when Zapruder had the film originally developed, it remained in a 16 millimeter format, double 8 wide film, remember, taken to Jameson Film Company, where they make 3 copies of it. Then they bring it back, they develop the 3 copies, and then they slit the film down the middle for the original and all 3 copies. So now they're 8 millimeter films. Well, there's something important to know about an 8 millimeter film. That once you've slit a 16 millimeter film down the middle to make it into an 8 millimeter film, you cannot put it back together again. It's impossible to put an 8 millimeter film into a 16 millimeter format. Cannot be done. And yet, Secret Service agent Bill Smith shows up at Nitpick with a 16 millimeter film that he says is the original. He says, well, it was donated by a guy in Dallas, which of course was totally untrue. But more significantly, he says, the film has come from Hawkeye Works. I've brought the film from Hawkeye Works. And I need you to do these blow-ups in a 16 millimeter format. And that's the film that we now know is the original Zapruder film. It was then slit down the middle after it was brought to Homer McMahon's team, and that purports to be the original. What is the significance of Hawkeye Works? We'll examine that in the next episode. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 15 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.